All right, so I've got Bryn here. I've got Ants here. I suppose in this case, Ants has some relevant qualifications. Got a PhD in, I think, what, political economy and international development. He'll correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And Unnatural Vegan released a video a few days ago. It's called Anti-Capitalism is Anti-Vegan. Both of these guys had, a range of critiques to make. So I thought I'd just give them a place to do it. I'm not really going to communicate a whole lot here. I'm just kind of going to let these guys do their thing. And with that, I'll just pass it over to you guys.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if you had anything that you want to say at the outset or if we just wanted to get going. Um, but I think that one of the big things to say just before is um, what we don't want to do in our critique, I guess, is make an anti-vegan argument, and what we don't want to do is totally bash on UV for trying to elucidate, what kind of political economic strategies might be the most effective for veganism, which I think is one of the underlying features of the video. Ultimately, my critiques are just based on some of the definitions that were used and some of the hyperbole and like lack of carefulness that was engaged in the video. And so one of the things that I want to do at the end of this critique is offer more clarity there and provide a possible steel man for some of the points that are made in the video.
Okay, yeah, perfect. So really what I wanted to do in this is just look over, some of the mistakes she made. I was going to, we'll start with neoliberalism, how she, seems to be offering a definition that's proprietary and, go into just the history of the ideology and, the type of policy packages that it has entailed when it has been implemented. Go over generally some of the problematic arguments she makes in terms of why being anti-capitalist is anti-vegan, and then go over, just some of the mistakes she makes when she defines communism, socialism, and the type of empirics she tries to marshal to, show that it's a failed system.
Right. Okay. So I guess we'll just start it up now.
Think that anti-capitalist sentiment is inherently anti-vegan. A couple months ago, I did a Q&A, and one of the questions was about my political ideology, and I was asked if I considered myself neoliberal, and I said, yeah, I would consider myself neoliberal. And then
yeah, so just before we get too far into the neoliberal thing, Isaac, if you don't mind going to my server and then going into the channel that starts with 3S.
Sure. I'm in 3S right now.
Yeah, so one of the big things that sort of jumped out to me right from the outset is that she's using this term inherently. And if you go and look at, say the Oxford Dictionary definition of inherently, or any other well-accepted definition of inherently, the big thing is that's invoking concepts of things like essential features, permanent features, characteristic features, and importantly, sort of necessary features. And so one of the things that I'm sort of worried about is that what she will do in the remainder of the video is point out or make a statement that there is like an inherent quality going on here, but there's a very particular kind of argument you have to produce when you're saying something is inherent or necessary to something else. In particular, to have an argument that offers necessitation, or in the case of what I think that she wants to do, show that something entails a contradiction. So, for example, if you want to show that this is like a necessary feature, you'd have to show that in all worlds, the antithesis of capitalism entails the antithesis of veganism, for example. Or more particularly, I think that the conclusion that she will need to argue for, wants to argue for, is that the affirmation of the antithesis of capitalism and the affirmation of the premises of veganism entails a contradiction. And that's a very weighty goal. If you were in a discussion with UV and you wanted to sort of push her on this, the question that you would be asking are, which premises of anti-capitalism, are in contradiction with veganism? And you'd want something like a formal argument from that. And as we've sort of talked about, and I'm sure that this has popped up in other videos on your channel, if you start pointing out just some basic examples of things that are like sort of vaguely contrary but not quite clearly in contradiction, or if you point to like temporary states of affairs, possibilities, probabilities, if you start gods of the gapsing, or even doing like comparative and relativistic analyses, those aren't going to give you necessitation. Those are just going to say something like, anti-capitalism is, less of a viable instrument for veganism, or anti-capitalism is not something that is doable for vegans right now, or it makes less sense for vegans to do right now. Those are the kinds of conclusions that you're going to get. So making this like very strong statement out of the gate is perhaps a little bit damaging to the goals of the video, because later on she does sort of weaken this claim back. One thing I'll note here too is that there's sort of a trend in online discourse, and there are other YouTube channels which you can find where the sort of parallel claims are made by anti-capitalists. Very frequently you can see claims like socialism is inherently vegan, or veganism is inherently socialist. If someone makes those claims, the same sort of demandingness can be made to them. You have to show an actual contradiction between, a capitalist worldview and a vegan worldview. You can't just give, these like sort of vague appeals to, things like temporary states or comparative analyses. You actually have to show that there's some kind of proposition or some kind of, view that is held in contradiction between the two. And those are the sort of things you should be looking for if words like inherent are used. If you had nothing else to say, I'm good to continue.
Yeah, we can continue.
And I kind of gave a little bit more detail, expanded on that a bit in a follow-up Q&A, because the comments on the first one, people were kind of mad at me. It ranged from people confusing neoliberalism and libertarianism, they're not the same thing, to kind of like you're dead to me type comments for not opposing capitalism, even equating it to fascism, even saying that it was inconsistent with veganism. So I wanted to address it, the kind of extreme anti-capitalist sentiment and how that relates to veganism. Shouldn't be controversial. For those who don't know, neoliberal is like your typical left-leaning social progressive, but also being generally pro-free market with few restrictions on a lot of industries like housing, but also very pro-welfare state, as libertarians would say. Neoliberals want a substantial safety net, often even supporting public options like healthcare, for instance. Not all neoliberals do. Of course, there's going to be disagreement when the private options aren't serving the public. Conservatives often accuse neoliberals of being socialist because they accuse everyone of being socialist, advocating for higher taxation, welfare. But ultimately, the wealth in society that funds that welfare is generated by capitalist mechanisms. Same is the case in, what people call European socialism, which isn't really socialism by definition. Still relies on profit motive, still has private ownership, even if a few select industries are publicly owned. Since socialism is commonly defined as like a transitional state to communism, communism being the goal, I'm going.
Okay, so just to say a few things here about, the mistake she makes about neoliberalism. I think she's conflating it really with Keynesian economic policies and some form of democratic socialism. Neoliberalism actually arose as a response. In terms of the policies that were implemented, it arose in the 1970s as a very clear alternative or reaction to what were seen then to be failures of Keynesianism and state intervention into the economy. So Keynesian economics generally advocates for the intervention of governments into economies in order to stabilize the business cycle, so that when unemployment hits a certain level, the government comes in, stabilizes demand. Doing this can avoid massive outbreaks of wealth inequality, income inequality, and just general poverty. So with the crisis of stagflation in the 70s, a number of economists associated with the University of Chicago relied on some of the arguments made by Hayek in his famous book, The Road to Serfdom, in which Hayek argued that all forms of government intervention in the economy essentially would take societies down a road to eventual totalitarianism. And he collapsed the distinction between different forms of government intervention. So here there was really no difference between fascism and totalitarian socialism or communism as seen in the Soviet Union. And this collapsing of different forms of government intervention allowed, critics of Keynesian economics and democratic socialism to make this claim that any form of government intervention was essentially a slippery slope down the road to tyranny. But what's interesting is that everything she's listed here as being part of neoliberalism, neoliberalism actually was a reaction against. So again, in the 1970s, its proponents argued for the retrenchment of the welfare state, for cutbacks in government expenditure, for a reduction in the marginal tax rate and corporate tax rates. The main proponents were Thatcher, and then it was continued in the United Kingdom, and then Reagan in the United States. It was continued by the Bush administrations, and in Chile, the Pinochet regime, after the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Allende, actually experimented with that as well. One of the best texts I've read on this, probably the best scholarly treatments of neoliberalism as a concept and its history, is A Brief History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey, who's a Marxist academic at City University of New York. So that's something people could look in if they want additional information on this.
Yeah, okay. Isaac, if you don't mind hopping to my server and going to the channel that starts with 52.
Sure. We are there.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, so I also had some issue here. One of the big things that I sort of otherwise enjoy about UV is that she tends to be relatively okay with being careful about her term usage and being clear about her term usage. But in this case, I think that something that many of the commenters on the video and Ants now has pointed out is that this is at best sort of an unclear usage of the term. I'm not sure that much in the video turns on it, so I don't want to grill her too hard on it. But I do propose that a better term that could have been used is what's called ordoliberalism. The history of neoliberalism even sort of predates the usage in the 1970s. It actually came up with in a meeting in the late 1930s, sort of as there was this like growing fear of fascism and communism. A group of intellectuals, including Hayek himself, met as a group to discuss strategies for moving capitalism forward. And what ended up coming out of that was actually something that is a little bit more in line with what she's talking about. However, after Pinochet and Thatcher and Reagan adopted the term themselves, or possibly co-opted the term, it sort of fell out of favor of labeling that kind of neoliberalism, and now that kind of neoliberalism is instead called ordoliberalism. So it was famously espoused by this German political philosopher named Eichen, who was sort of at the root of a lot of the sort of German democratic socialism that you see today. He pushed for a lot of the welfare state policies and a lot of the regulation, actually. One thing that I have sort of seen pushed by commenters, and you and I even sort of briefly talked about this, is that what she's best described as a social democrat. That is a good enough term, I think, but if we're being very particular, I think that there's some reason to be careful about using a social democrat as well. The roots of social democrat, and explicitly about third wayism, which is sort of the root of social democracy, was that it was actually a little bit more skeptical of welfare states. And in fact, it was much more skeptical about deregulation than neoliberalism and ordoliberalism. So I've got a variety of links in the Discord there that people can go check out if they want to look into that history and see sort of the differences between social democracy, neoliberalism, and ordoliberalism. And then just another thing that's sort of become like an emergent feature is this idea that there is like a hegemonic neoliberalism. Indeed, I think what has sort of happened in virtue of like a lot of the adoption of the term by people like Thatcher and Reagan, is that there's this idea that there's a hegemonic sort of neoliberalism, which even UV sort of commits herself to. She sort of tries to suggest that there's like this specific set of like policies and specific sort of set of policy endpoints for neoliberalism. But what is sort of pointed out by the economic historian for the AIER, which is a big think tank and journal in economics, is that there really isn't much of a hegemonic term, and the closest hegemonic term is the Reagan definition. So at sort of best, it is a very unclear term, and at worst, it just sort of is totally divorced from her ideas. The best thing that I will grant her, though, is that there is a growing sort of online group of individuals who call themselves neoliberalists. They are on Reddit and Twitter mostly, but they actively admit to co-opting the term, and they're trying to um, regain it and redefine it. They are somewhat in agreement with ideas about the welfare state, but even then, it's usually on economic principles that they would accept arguments for welfare states rather than ethical terms. Usually, their arguments are something along the lines of, look, if we had a public option for healthcare, due to the inelasticity of that public healthcare, we'd actually reduce, the dead weight loss, or we'd actually have, better pricing, or we'd actually have like a more effective economy. It's not making the ethical argument that I think some people are more likely to make about healthcare. And I think that is sort of what UV is getting at instead. So yeah, just to summarize again, it's unclear at best. It's sort of probably not the best term she could have used. She probably should have used the term ordo-liberal instead, or social democrat. And maybe in the future it will be like a term that she can use, but at least for right now, it doesn't really work. But I think we can move on.
Yeah, I'll just also add one thing that, part of this confusion has been created by the fact that a lot of the advocates of neoliberalism implement policies that really tend to contradict the ideology. So while Reagan was a huge fan, and Bush, of small government, minimal government intervention, simply the protection of property, as opposed to any kind of intervention in the economy, Reagan presided over this massive expansion and deficit spending, but it was spending that was geared towards military expenditure and not social welfare provisioning. So that's something to point out as well.
Yeah, right. I think that's actually like a big thing, is that there's a lot of sort of inadvertent populism that actually gets baked into a lot of like contemporary neoliberalism. They sort of try to hide it, I think, through a lot of this like sort of were evidence-based policy language, but at least historically and at least in practice, there has been a lot of populism and a lot of lobbying that has driven the quote unquote evidence. I think that one of the things that economists in like the orthodox world are becoming more and more open about is that the idea that the transfer from like academic economics to politics was like this like completely linear process, sort of evaporated in 2008 when a lot of the issues with the idea of evidence-based economic policy and model-based economic policy sort of got brought to light as not particularly sound. And there's been a ton of work that has been done in the meantime. And just to like admit from my side, I mean, I myself consider myself a evidence-based economist and evidence-based policy wonk, but this idea that it was always pure evidence-based is not particularly historically accurate. And like you said, there's a lot of sort of co-option of those ideals and of those sorts of policy directions because they sound nice to the average voter who's in the United States at least a blue collar worker, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their theory actually supported that or that they were even doing anything left in the first place. I think that's sort of everything I have to say on that topic.
Yeah, we can continue.
Going to talk about focus on communism here. So why are neoliberals generally pro-free market and anti-communism? Is the question I want to answer. Philosophy is essential when it comes to ethics, but you can't just like think really hard to figure out empirical facts, right? Like when it comes to economics and economic policies and which actually work in practice, which result in a functioning system that promotes a GDP that's conducive to human well-being, you can think up an ethical system.
So I don't have a channel on this point, but GDP and the like sort of reification of it is sort of something that I take a lot of issue with, and I think a lot of economists would take a lot of issue with. GDP is like a very particular figure. It doesn't necessarily track with things like well-being. It doesn't even necessarily track with the health of the economy. Now, there's a statement that we can offer here that, what she really means is, like economic growth or, economic health, and those are the things that we're tracking with. But even in that case, it's not necessarily clear that those things are going to track with well-being either. Now, we can grant that from the outset and say, like, okay, economic activity and economic health are correlated with well-being. It might be a reasonable assumption in most cases, but it's sort of begging the question against, like, at least some subsets of anti-capitalists. And I think this will become like sort of an issue with the remainder of the video, in that she's attacking only really a subset of anti-capitalists as well. Certain kinds of very radical anti-capitalists, like primitivists or micro communists, might argue that there's no reason to think that macroeconomic health is actually associated with well-being. In fact, it might be inversely associated. And so this like hyper focus on economic measures might not be the most relevant feature. Instead, if what we're doing is making an argument about ethics and well-being, we should be trying to find other things that more closely match that. A negative utilitarian might try to quantify some way that we would measure suffering. A hedonist might be looking at something like a human happiness index, something like that. Those things don't necessarily track with economic activity, and they very rarely closely track with something like GDP.
Yeah, I'll just echo exactly what you said on GDP. It's important to keep in mind here that measures of GNP, you can have GNP and GDP steadily rising in a country while you have increased rates of things like starvation, poverty, and just a general drop in well-being. So the dependency theorists pointed this out very specifically with Latin America. You had periods where there was an increase in GNP based on the fact that you had these very small enclaves of development, which saw an expansion in mining industries with very little forward and backward linkages to the rest of the economy or spillover effects or industrial upgrading. And because of the capital intensive nature of those type of industries, you also had rising GDP and GDP with increased rates of unemployment. So it's definitely important to see that on its own, GDP or GNP don't really tell us much about the well-being being experienced by the population in any given society.
Yeah, so I think that's sort of everything we have there. We'll just continue the video.
System in which it is wrong for one person to ever profit off the work of another person. You can call that exploitation, but in order to put that into practice, you have to just not care about the consequences at all. You would have to ignore all of the times communism has been tried and all of the times it has failed, which is every single time it's been tried, it has failed. It has caused immeasurable suffering and death. I'm a consequentialist.
Okay, so if you don't mind, Isaac, just switching to the channel with 225.
We are there.
Okay, so before I delve too deeply into this subject, what I don't want to do with anything that I say here is sort of glorify or apologize for any of the like historic atrocities that have been due to communistic, socialistic, and authoritarian regimes. I'll talk about that in just a little bit of a second, but the goal here is just to sort of get at what she's arguing here on the concept. I think that what's interesting is that she, and some commenters have pointed this out, is that she sort of just bakes this in as a throwaway statement in the video. She doesn't appeal to any particular examples, and she definitely could. Big names that pop out are cases like the Holodomor in the USSR, the Great Chinese Famine, where you have these like incredible combinations of natural disaster, pseudoscience, and almost certainly intentional forms of genocide. But at the same time, she makes this throwaway statement without analyzing any of the other examples that are contrary to her view, nor does she at any point in the video analyze any of the examples that might be dismaying of capitalism. I'll just focus on the first bit at first. One of the issues here is that there are at least four countries in the world that I think that we could soundly put into like the Marxist, Leninist camp and say do exist today. And one of the like the big examples that's sort of thrown out there usually is Cuba. And if you see on that page, and I've got sources in there if people want to go and look at them, and also the Wikipedia page makes it explicit and clear. Cuba, despite being quite possibly like the most socialized or socialistic state as far as the Marxist is concerned in the world today, it's at the head, like at the front of the pack when it comes to the Latin American countries, despite being under economic embargo from the United States and the Western world for almost 50 years at this point. The the Cuban population is one of the most educated, one of the healthiest populations in Latin America, and they effectively have eradicated poverty and malnutrition. Of course, there are sincere issues with Cuba as well. I mean, they don't have much in the way of luxuries. There's a lot of freedom of speech abuses there. There's issues with policing. There's a growing black market has developed in response to a lot of the needs and wants of people not being met. But this idea that there's just sort of this like universal and like categorical rule that communism has failed is not particularly true if you are being honest about the state of affairs. We can continue that into the other countries that I would label as Marxist-Leninist. For example, China has been a pretty significant portion of the total poverty reduction as part of the Millennium Goals. And then Vietnam and Laos are, incredibly successful countries as well. So it's not so easy to just make a throwaway statement like this, and it's sort of like it's sort of begs the question about what her like intentions were about the video, if it was meant to just be a conceptual analysis or if she meant to make it more informative. It sort of makes me wonder why no sources were brought in. The other issue too is that sort of as the recurring theme that I brought up earlier, she really only attacks a subset of anti-capitalists in this video. From this point on, she's only attacking, Marxist-Leninist states and specifically authoritarian planned economies. One of the issues, though, is that there are many anti-capitalist states that, follow the libertarian model or follow an anarchistic model, amongst others, that have relatively reasonable health outcomes and well-being outcomes. For example, Merez in Mexico and Rojava in the Middle East are anti-capitalistic, anti-hierarchical societies that, for the most part, have been relatively successful at their goals, even though there's been, an extreme amount of pressure on them from the outside. So this whole throwaway statement is just sort of confusing to me, at least on the sense that there actually has been some success in socialism. And so making this sort of argument that you're the evidence-based policy but refusing to actually look at the evidence is a little bit confusing. On the flip side, there have been a whole host of capitalist countries or countries that are, fervently anti-socialist that have led to sincere human rights abuses, or at least have not performed up to the same speed as like comparable socialist countries.
Okay, I will actually pipe up once.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's fervently.
All right. Yeah, for example, like a very frequent comparison that's made is between India and China, where there was this very large split in economic policy that occurred during the 20th century. And while China has grown pretty rapidly, India has sort of struggled until recently and experiences immense amounts of poverty that has actually only sort of grown in terms of the dispersion of poverty, or like the Pareto inefficiency of the total economy over time. Whereas with China, there's been a relative raising of the floor in China, as well as despite this incredible explosion of millionaires and billionaires in recent years, the overall inequality in China has decreased over time. for all of these sorts of things that I'm claiming to, there are sources in this Discord if people would like to go and look at it. And then sort of the final thing that I want to say about all this is that this argument just isn't going to be relevant right from the outset either. If we go back to what I originally mentioned, if what you're arguing for is sort of this inherent quality of something, or if you're arguing for the necessitation of something, you can't just look at comparative analyses, and you can't just look at past experiments, as we'll call them. You have to be actually pointing out propositions or values of the systems that are going to contradict. Now, you might make like a consequentialist argument, as she's about to do, that there is reasons to believe that capitalism produces more well-being than socialism inductively, but that's not going to get you to like some kind of inherent or essential quality. So it just isn't going to be something that quite gets us there until she either weakens her stance or provides a stronger argument.
Right. I'll also just add, to build on some of the things you've said here, is that her failure to define what she means by communism and socialism, I think, taints the entire analysis and video going forward. For example, as you mentioned in here, China, arguably, as many analysts would point out and contemporary Marxists would point out, ceased being, a communist or Marxist-Leninist state in the 1980s when they opened up the market. Yeah, and now the landscape is littered just with transnational corporations that are taking advantage of the low cost in labor, right? And numerous Western transnational corporations that produce many of the products we buy are, conducting their operations in China. So if you're going to look at the misery that has plagued China in terms of the exploitation of labor and state atrocities and suppression of unions, etc., since the 1980s to now, it's very questionable whether you could say that that's the outcome of totalitarian communism or Marxist-Leninism, etc. And also, even if you go back before the 1980s, as you pointed out, a very apt comparison would be between China and India. And one Nobel Prize-winning economist, Amartya Sen, has written quite a bit about this in terms of studies he's looked at. And he's pointed out that some of the major deaths in China because of the famines which took place during the Great Leap Forward are what critics of communism like to marshal to point to the failures and atrocities implicit within communist ways of organizing the economy. And he points out that if you look at India from the 1980s, over a 10-year period or a 15-year period, I believe, the deaths caused by starvation and lack of medical attention and lack of education and lack of provisioning of just basic foods, exporting foods, devoting land to the export of very, very vital crops while large numbers of the population starved, that tallied up to about 100 million right throughout the decade of the 1980s, greatly exceeding what China experienced during the Great Leap Forward. So again, we could call that then a failure of democratic capitalism, to use her definition of failure, it seems. We can get into a little bit more about that as the video progresses.
Yeah, I mean, I put this out in the textual analysis, which I'm not covering totally, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of scholars, and I think that they sort of rightfully would suggest that China is not a socialist state. But that's sort of the issue when you get into a lot of these critiques, is they end up entering sort of like a Schrodinger's like socialist state where all the failures of China are due to it's being a communistic state rather than being like an authoritarian plutocracy. And then when you look at like the successes of China, for example, the fact that up until 2008, a very large portion of the global reduction in poverty was due to the reduction in poverty that was going on in China. Those are successes of neoliberal capitalism. And again, like the big recurring trend, as we've sort of both agreed on, is that there's no clear definition of socialism that's given here. And at the most, she's really just attacking this like one specific subset of socialism, which is planned economy, authoritarian, extremely orthodox, Marxist-Leninist, Stalinistic regimes, which is not a completely fair treatment of socialism, nor is it like a very in-depth historic treatment of even that subset. As I was sort of mentioning it, if she loosens up her argument going forward, and she sort of drops this idea that it's an inherent quality, instead it's sort of like a which instruments could we use today thing. One thing that is sort of really important, though, is that when she starts to generate reasons why we should not be anti-capitalistic. Uh, she has to take into account that because she's attacking the Marxist, Marx himself and Marxists themselves do accept that there is a stage of capitalism or a utility to capitalism, especially in technologizing. Their argument isn't necessarily that we should be moving to socialism immediately. They would offer that there is a stage of capitalism, or this sort of like dialectical understanding of capitalism where you have a period where socialism and capitalism are sort of intertwined. So it can't just be this like black and white analysis either. There has to be some level of nuance given, which like to this point in the video just is not available.
Right. I'll also mention that I think what's ironic here is that her broad understanding of what she seems to mean when she says socialism and communism flows from the standard, not her definition, but the standard definition of neoliberalism, which is again rooted in the ideas of Hayek, who argued that there is no distinction between state forms of intervention in the economy. Any such intervention by the state into an economy is fundamentally anti-market, anti-freedom, hence anti-capitalism, right? So that allows people then to just essentially paint China as by definition, a totalitarian communist state because of its massive state intervention. When even since the 1980s, as I mentioned, I would argue China is anything but communist at this point.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's actually like one of the more confusing aspects of the video too. That in my mind, I write this up in the textual analysis that weirdly earlier on in the video, she mentions that she's focused on communism, not socialism. But that's not a distinction that the Marxist makes either. Really, I think that the distinction as it's used in like the contemporary discourse is actually just a misnomer for the distinction between the lower stage and higher stage of communism. But the issue is there are really no higher stages, any countries or states that are in the higher stage of communism, nor has there ever been any in history. So really, it is an attack on socialism and an attack on the lower stage of communism, if we're going on an evidence-based level. But like you said, she's not making it quite clear either which countries or which states she would even draw into that analysis, because she sort of only flashes this like definition at the beginning that actually would include both, because if I'm correct, it just flashes the idea of social ownership, but state ownership and communal ownership are both going to fall under that definition. And then because of like the vagary that's sort of being brought into her own definitions, yeah, she really is just able to criticize authoritarian regimes, which if she doesn't do this in her video, but it's a sort of frequent characteristic of strawmanning attacks where they use that sort of definition to bring in states that really are not arguably socialist, like Pol Pot's revolution. They try to bring in, for example, like the Nazis, or they try to bring in like modern day China, even though an orthodox Marxist would not really accept those states as meaningfully in any stage of socialism. And radical like Trotskyists would actually suggest that those are degenerating worker states or just straightforwardly like authoritarian regimes. So it's not clear that it's not clear that it's an actually relevant analysis. In many ways, it seems like it's a category error right from the outset.
Yeah, I mean, what seems to be happening here is a lot of people, I think her included, seem to automatically conflate the abolition or attacks on private property with communism, whereby, Marx is, as you pointed out, his understanding of the final stage of communism entailed the abolition of concentrations of private property, but it also included delegation of control to actual workers. And as you pointed out, if we're using that standard orthodox definition of the Marxist understanding of communism, no state has ever approached that. Certainly not, the Khmer Rouge or China or even Lenin and Trotsky. You could make the argument. So you have to keep that in mind as well, as you said.
Yeah, and then just before we move on, I mean, the other issue too is those definitions. Those are getting at the productive method and the ownership of the means of production. it would be a whole other discussion and debate for us, although I think you and I generally agree, but there are forms of socialism that will, advise the social ownership of the means of production, but still retain many of the features that people are wanting to point out as causing the failure of socialism. So, for example, like market socialism retains marketplaces. Certain forms of like libertarian socialism do away with the authoritarianism. There are, for example, Noam Chomsky advocates for a form of anti-capitalism that retains things like marketplaces, but is structured around like collectives of unions who argue democratically amongst themselves. So those kinds of attacks on things like centralized organization of the economy or not having marketplaces, attacks on things like supply and demand, while they are relevant to some kinds of anti-capitalists, are not necessarily relevant to anti-capitalism simpliciter. Anti-capitalism, as understood by anti-capitalists, is a very particular kind of thing. But I think we've said a lot about this. If you have nothing else to say, I'm good to go, move on.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick thing. Like you said, and as the scholar Ellen Wood, she's a Marxist, she points out, markets predate capitalism, but there's a difference between markets by opportunity and markets by compulsion. And so since markets have predated capitalism, they do have an important role to play. I see no reason to say that in an actual socialist or communist state, you would have to completely do away with markets in that sense. So I would agree with that.
I care about consequences in terms of suffering. Most people care more about having a job, helping their family, than they do about some abstract principle that says it's wrong for their bosses to make a profit off of their labor. And I care more about what people want than I do deciding what people want for them or what I think is better for them based on some sort of cosmic justice. Injustice in and of itself is not harm. It's only harm when the consequences of injustice actually harm people or sentient beings. And that harm can range from material harm, disease, lead in your water being shot, to immaterial harm like damaged self-esteem. There may be some level of inevitable harm there when we're talking about capitalism. I'm sure there is. But that only matters if there is an alternative that is better, that if the harm that capitalism causes is worse than some sort of evidence-based alternative. But there is no evidence-based alternative. Or there is one, but the evidence goes in the opposite direction. Talking about ending capitalism because of the inevitable harms without some solution, without something that actually works better, is like talking about ending food because food on some level is inevitably harmful. True, but maybe dying is worse. Regulated capitalism with a strong safety net is the best system we have based on the systems we actually have evidence on, which is to say probably quite a bit more welfare than we currently have in the US. It's unreasonable to advocate for hypothetical alternatives when they range from untested to repeated failures. Again, you can't just reason out the ideal economic system for humans or for a particular country without evidence in practice. That's not being rational, it's not being scientifically minded, it's being dogmatic. I've talked before about how not all use is abuse. The same goes for exploitation, which refers to unfair use. Some vegans say you can't be vegan unless you are socialist or communist, but there's nothing in the term or the definition that is anti-capitalist. So the argument...
Yeah, that's like the entire point. Right from... She seems to get the idea, right? There's nothing about the definition that is clearly going to be definitionally opposed to one or the other. I think like she has lucidity on that point. So it's unclear why she's making this sort of like inherent argument, except other than that it's a rhetorical strategy. It's just a very weird statement. And like I said, when you talk to people who make these sort of like bold claims about what kind of things veganism entails, if they're making this sort of, inherent quality criticism, you just need to ask them, what are the values of the systems that contradict? Like what are what are the propositions that one holding one system and one holding another system would be unable to agree upon. And so far in the video, nothing of that sort has been offered. It's only sort of this, very throwaway appeal to evidence of the implementation of anti-capitalism, which just doesn't do it.
Argument is something like,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out there's also some problems here with her argument here that if you don't necessarily have a very clear alternative painted in a blueprint, you should just continue along the lines of a current given system, et cetera, and then not try to, look for any type of alternatives, which is an argument that has been made, repeatedly in many different contexts, right? I mean, I'm not trying to be too inflammatory here when I say this, but even in the U.S. South, one of the arguments made by the slave masters during that period was that, based on a paternal type of racism, they argue that this is the best solution currently, even for, the slaves, that we don't know what's actually going to happen with the abolition of the system, and it's in the interest of all of us to actually just continue along, this pathway because it's been tried. We know that it works, according to their understanding of what works for the economy, and it's best for all the actors. But there's no reason to actually, stick with that type of a strategy when it comes to looking at alternatives and to use that argumentation to justify any given or current system.
Right. Yeah. She brings up this point later on, so I had more written about it for later on, but it's sort of a very weird statement, and it's not one I'm sure that like most ethicists would agree upon. As I sort of have written for later, there's a lot of ways in which you can attack that idea from the direction of like a consistency test, or even from some kinds of ethics like the virtue of doing what she's talking about, and even just from the perspective of which kinds of evidences you're bringing onto the table. It's just there's a lot of weird sort of assumptions that are made all the way through. I'm gonna continue if you have nothing else to say, because she gets into the meat of what her argument for that sort of is right away, and I had a lot to say about it.
Sure, go for it.
Veganism means no exploitation. Exploitation is capitalism. Therefore, veganism means no capitalism. Two very big.
Yeah, so this argument that's sort of offered is really weird to me for quite a few reasons. One is there's a lot of people in this space who, if she had reached out to for formalizing an argument, would have responded and would have helped. And instead, what we're given is this sort of very poorly written, informal argument. The way that I have it written in my document is I've actually noted that premise 2 seems to be written incorrectly. Or
Bryn, I'm just gonna cut you off because you didn't have me go over to the Discord. Is there something there that I should be looking at right now?
Oh yeah, I mean, if people want to, if you want to go to 295, I guess that works.
Sure. Oh yeah, we're there.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I've labeled premise 2 here because she says exploitation is capitalism. I've got, at this point, it's sort of maybe getting on her for grammar and semantics, but I think that there is value to grammar and semantics, especially when you're making a very broad, very general argument. Being specific and precise and careful about your language, I think, is very important. If she's using like the copula is here, the argument can just sort of be denied right out of hand. But if it's more likely, that it is the is of identity, it can also sort of just be rejected out of hand. And so the argument, it's very weak, at least right at face value. It's not clear why we would accept that like exploitation and capitalism are, analytically identical to each other. And if what she really means to say is sort of this like copula definition of capitalism, that capitalism is exploitative, which is the alternative premise that I would have offered to her, that's at like a point where it becomes quite a bit more debatable, and where there's actually some substantive argumentation that can be offered. So there's at least some rewriting in the version offered. And really what would be nice is if there was actually like a clear formal argument where the infrastructure is shown and proven, and definitions are clearly offered, so that this kind of thing can be actually debated by the relevant sides of the discussion. But the other big problem I had is that despite being a consequentialist herself, she offers something that's like, for the most part, appears to be some kind of deontological argument, where it just seems to assert that what it means for us to accept veganism is for us to accept no exploitation towards animals. And then sort of categorically that capitalism is exploitative, therefore categorically vegan means no acceptance of capitalism. But I think that for the most part, like usually when I interact with vegans, they tend to fall more so into the consequentialist domain. In fact, like most applied ethicists, especially lay people, seem to fall into the consequentialist domain. And so I worry that by only including this argument, and this is the only argument that does appear in the video, she's going to be strawmanning quite a few anti-capitalists, and in fact quite a few vegan anti-capitalists. So it's not clear why this was the argument that was used. I would have hoped that, and hopefully in the future, that when people make videos like this, they try to formalize their arguments and also try to be careful that they're not just talking about a subset of any relevant party in the argument, but that they're really including all relevant parties, or that they're generating, different arguments for different kinds of parties. In the Discord write-up that I have, I gave an example of like a consequentialist argument that you might give. So you might hypothesize that with socialism, it's easier to regulate and control the kinds of production that are done. Therefore, it's consequentially better to accept socialism over capitalism, or that you might argue that the like total amount of exploitation under capitalism is significantly worse than the total amount of exploitation under socialism. You might even argue in like a very anthropocentric way that the level of exploitation, or the level of harm, or the level of suffering, or the level of whatever utility is so differential between the two systems that regardless of how one affects the vegan question and affects animal welfare, that we ought to go with the other anyways. An example of this is, as I point out in the doc and have a source for, is that China, if we're taking the argument that it is like a socialist state, very recently has begun to direct its economy to be much more plant-based. They're seeking to reduce, as a secular trend, their consumption of meat by 50% by 2030. I'm not aware of any other country that has the explicit goal or the explicit control over their economy to do such a thing. So someone looking at the case study of China might very well make the argument that they have more political will and more political determination and more political tempo than a market economy or a capitalist economy, which would be much more open to someone who wants to make the consequential argument. By just limiting it to this deontological argument, with the very peculiar definition of exploitation that she chooses in a few seconds, I really do fear that what she's doing is offering a straw man, and a poorly worded one at that.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll also point out that it's not clear what she even means when she's talking about failures, or how she's actually measuring failures. Is she talking about economic development? Well, if you look at the Soviet Union after it actually adopted communism after the revolution, and compare it to countries that were, in a similar position developmentally, like India, like Brazil, the Soviet Union immediately, overtook them in a relatively short period of time in areas like heavy industry, exports, and even across some metrics which are related to the standard of living. This was accompanied, obviously, with a lot of brutality, the collectivization of agriculture, etc. But how are you defining failure and success? I mean, is she looking at, the disintegration of, communist societies? And if she's including China as a communist society, then it's unclear how she can even make the claim that it's, all these societies have actually failed in some way or another. So that it would be important to, get that out as well, which she doesn't actually go into really.
Right.
very big problems with this. First, you have to accept the very specific Marxist definition of exploitation / capitalism, which is essentially begging the question when you define anti-exploitation as requiring Marxism because you've defined capitalism as inherently exploitative. I don't see any reason to accept this definition, the Marxist definition.
This was one of the more peculiar and sort of like pet peeve parts of the video for me. She offers, a definition of exploitation as understood by Marxists. I think that if you looked at it and researched it, there's a lot of room for arguing that might not actually be how Marxists are always going to understand it. The argument, the definition given, I think leans more towards like a Marxist humanist definition, where it brings into the definition like moralistic qualities and sentimental qualities, whereas there are pure economic definitions of exploitation that are used by the classical economists, including Smith and Ricardo, and eventually Marx, which are purely talking about economic terms and things like value, instead of the sort of more morally laden one that she chooses. But the really peculiar thing is that she suggests that this definition is question begging or makes the argument question begging. And I just don't understand how that's the case in any way that, an argument of the form, if you have three sides, you are a triangle, you have three sides, therefore you are a triangle, would also have to be question begging. The point of deductive arguments is to elucidate the relationships between kinds of definitions and to showcase the ways in which like analytic identities about things relate to each other. By just pointing out that something is becoming definitional is not particularly interesting, and it can't even really be question begging, because as she points out, she disagrees with the definition. If it were purely question begging, it wouldn't, in my mind, be reasonable for her to just disagree with it. The entire point of the debate is whether or not capitalism is exploitative or not. And just by saying that it's definitional, therefore it's question begging, is not a particularly interesting answer. Instead, what we're looking for is some kind of argument that capitalism is not exploitative, or if we were making the previous argument consequentialist, that it is less exploitative than socialism. But neither is sort of offered right off the gun. So it was a very confusing part of the video for me.
Yeah, it's very difficult to even know how to respond to this part of the video substantively, because she says she sees no reason to accept the Marxist definition of exploitation, which by that I take to mean the labor theory of value, but she doesn't give any justification or rationale for that dismissal. So, I mean, if you look in the literature, there are, some good arguments made as to why there are some flaws with the LTV. As you're familiar with the transformation problem, whether it's internally consistent, whether you can actually even make the transition from prices to production to market prices. I mean, these are things that are found in the publications that Marxists have debated. So she could have, maybe asked somebody about that, or at least, gone into it a little bit. But giving no rationale and just saying she sees no reason to accept it isn't very helpful. And so, I mean, how do you respond to that substantively? She's just choosing not to accept something without any real kind of, substantive or proper reasoning behind it.
Right. Yeah, it's weird. And I think if someone intended to make a video that was of this sort, and intended to give it a fair treatment in the future, the sort of thing that you would be looking to do, I think, is actually drawing up some of the historical, anti-capitalist theorists you could draw from Marx, Engels, Lenin, and also hopefully from non-Marxist anti-capitalists as well, who have their own theories of exploitation. But also importantly, like some of the contemporary researchers on exploitation who, have attempted to expand upon or reformulate some of the Marxian concepts in ways that are empirically verifiable, or, testable, or, just sort of much more clear. A pretty big example in the literature is Romer, who argues for a libertarian form of socialism and something that's more parallel to Marxism than other forms of anti-Marxist socialism by looking at things like labor trends and looking at the levels of exploitation and actually giving, concrete definitions of these terms rather than sort of the vague appeals that are given here. And there are people who have responded to Romer who use, econometric analysis or even like conceptual analysis of the terms. Those are all things that someone, if they wanted to give a fair treatment of the concept, could actually go and appeal to it and read. These are things that are out there. I don't understand why this part of the video ended up being so dismissive out of hand and, had this like sort of like ludicrous claim that it was just question begging. It just didn't really make any sense.
Yeah.
Definition of exploitation, I think it's much better defined as unfair use, and what exactly that means is a lot more complex. Is there sometimes or even often exploitation in capitalistic systems? Of course. There are unambiguous cases, like obvious cases of exploitation like wage theft and broken contracts. The same with animal agriculture. No choice is given to the animal, obviously, and obviously it's impossible for there to be any sort of fair exchanged or any sort of deal made. So yeah, pretty unambiguous exploitation. There's also a strong case to be made for exploitation in the breakdown of regulatory systems, like monopolies, but that doesn't mean we can't understand how to evaluate fair exchanges. Do we have a long way to go?
So this sort of rescue that she offers immediately was also really confusing to me. She offers a distinction, but it's not clear that there's actually a difference. She gives this novel term, unfair use, but she doesn't define that term either. And then in her sort of ostensive definition of unfair use, she uses the word exploitation herself and offers many of the ways in which capitalism can be arguably exploitative. So it was just sort of very, very weird to me that what she ends up doing is providing reasonable grounds to reject the definition previously, and more importantly, to reject the argument, the deontic argument that was given from the outset. She sort of rescues the point briefly at the end by saying that, well, we have, economics, we have, political science, we can begin to understand how to evaluate things like fair exchanges. But to me, this is just special pleading. I don't see why it wouldn't be on the table for the socialist at this point to just say, well, look, all the socialist has to do is say that they're going to, begin to have to understand how to generate non-market, non-private ownership exchanges as well. Those are things that are still on the table unless you can give like a conceptual analysis for why such a thing would fail. She needs to give a symmetry breaker between those two things rather than just sort of specially pleading her way out of it.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. What's interesting is she defines when she's talking about problems with capitalism, she's looking at certain excesses, the breaking of contracts, etc. And there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't then just try to point to the failures of socialism or the empirical examples of socialism that we have, and simply say that those were also based on certain excesses that would adequate state intervention and the modification of certain failures, we could get to a point where you have an adequate socialist society which isn't plagued by those type of failures or those type of abuses in the future. And what's also interesting here is that she talks about the problem with capitalism as the breaking of contracts, market contracts. And what's interesting is that the Marxist view of capitalism, or the problem with capitalism, which she dismisses, is that it has nothing to do with contracts. It's actually about the asymmetrical distribution of class power based on ownership and exclusion that allows certain actors to construct contracts, labor contracts, in a fashion that allows them to then engage in a form of exploitation and generate surplus value, right? So, I mean, looking just at the Marxist critique of capitalism, it has nothing really to do in terms of, violations of contractual arrangements or with the excesses of capitalism as she's actually defined it. It's something that's, built in to the labor theory of value in terms of how exploitation works and how profits are generated, which goes to the core of the system.
Yeah, I mean, this is just like, again, it's just one of the biggest issues with this video is that it really only is attacking, a subset of anti-capitalist sentiment. And it's really only attacking it in a way that would address only a subset of that subset, and in a way that's like kind of strawmanish. There's a lot of opportunities on the table for the anti-capitalist to just accept that the things that she's talking about as problems of capitalism are also problems in socialism. In fact, they are the problems of historical socialism. And one thing that I'll point out is that a pretty frequent talking point of Marxists is that Marxism should be understood scientifically, and that the revolutions that occur are steps forward in the sort of scientific process of determining how socialism works. There's sort of this view that, Marx gave this extensive, policy pamphlet for how socialism should be enacted and how, communism should be achieved. But, there's nothing of the sort. The kinds of things that approach that, the works of Lenin, of Hoxha, and of others, those are analyses about things that are going on at the time during their revolutions or just before their revolutions. And there's no reason to think that there's sort of this intrinsic property of anti-capitalism that makes it unscientific and like unprogressive about its ideals. The idea that it is just inherently dogmatic is something that's just thrown in by her, and it seems incredibly unfair to the anti-capitalist.
Yeah, I should also point out that it's not very clear how she's really defining capitalism as a system of economic organization, right? I mean, if you use the Marxist definition, it's basically the separation of workers from the means of subsistence and means of production or capital goods, and hence the commodification of labor power, in which case a large number of current societies are capitalist. But if you're looking at, the pure textbook neoclassical definition of capitalism, really no current society is capitalist either, if you're using that pure textbook definition, because
Right.
Yeah, we have to understand, since the Great Depression at least, government intervention to stabilize the business cycle, to stabilize society, to actually, enhance employment opportunities has been the norm, even in the most staunch neoliberal societies such as the United States. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Right, okay.
To go in creating a fairer market via regulation? Certainly. Arguably, we still struggle with monopolies. But that doesn't mean communism is the answer. Which brings me to the second problem. There is no evidence for a practicable alternative. The reason we can say animal agriculture is wrong is because we have well-established alternatives. We know humanity can survive on a plant-based diet. We can grow plants, we can grow only plants, we can feed the world's population, and we can do it without animal products. We just need a shift in the market, one product instead of another. If there were evidence that veganism had the same catastrophic consequences that communism does, like we couldn't grow plants without manure, or we didn't know how to make B12, then we couldn't say animal agriculture is wrong. We couldn't advocate for its abolition because we would have no viable alternative, unless or.
So we briefly talked about this earlier, but she makes it much more clear here.
Can I get a word
ends
in
up
on
making
this?
it even more confusing.
Can I get a word in on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Yeah. Okay, can I just play back what she just said there? Because
Yeah, go ahead.
it sounded like she said that the only reason we can say something is wrong, or at least a necessary condition for saying something is wrong, is that there is no practicable alternative.
Right.
But how is that compatible with being a consequentialist, right? Because
Right.
oh, is that what you're about to say?
Yeah,
Because
if you want to add to it, I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
well, it's just, what's the contradiction between being in a situation that, like, of, I don't know, say like maximal suffering that just produces pure negative utility, but which we're not aware of any alternative to, right? You could be in a situation like that and not know an alternative, but wouldn't the situation still be bad just in virtue of its consequences?
Right.
Like, it seems like you'd have to unintentionally add some other kind of ethical concern there, maybe deontological, but of course UV is like staunchly anti-deontological, so I think maybe she just didn't notice that that statement is kind of weird on consequentialism, because there's not actually, well, I saying it's kind of weird is an understatement. I actually don't understand how it makes sense on consequentialism, again, just because
Right.
it's, things are right or wrong in terms of their consequences, right? Something could produce completely negative consequences and there could not be an alternative, but it's still wrong just because all wrong means is produces negative consequences, right? What's the contradiction between something producing like infinite negative utility and us not being aware of a practical alternative? Like, that's just gonna, how is that, like, am I fucking crazy here? It just doesn't seem compatible with consequentialism, what you just said there.
Yeah, I mean, and this was sort of my critique. for example, in like the negative utilitarian case, I think that the way that she's using practicable is to say that, you know, the agents of the relevant system stay alive and they're doing something. But that seems like a very weird necessary condition of what we look for in our ethical obligations or our norms. You know, the negative utilitarians think that there's such a level of suffering to living that we should just stop practicing living. There's all sorts of ways that we could, you know, draw a parallel to this with the vegan case. If it were the case that there was, you know, no way to go vegan in a way that, you know, allowed us to remain alive, the consequentialist, if they find that the overall utility of the system, you know, is negative, there's an obligation or a demand that's generated there, perhaps, for us to just stop living. Now, the arguments against that are usually to point out that no, in fact, there's a significant amount of well-being generated, or they bring in deontic concerns or like virtue theoretic concerns. But to say that there has to be a practical alternative for a multitude of reasons is just very, very confusing. The other thing that I wanted to bring up too is that there's another aspect of practicability here that has some kind of like embeddedness to it, or she's, you know, offering something enthematic here. We don't have to go to it, but in my write-up, what I point out is, you know, practicability or like safe alternatives is a scalar, and there's many different levels of practicability. Arguably, if there was no way to be healthy on a vegan diet, quote unquote, or if it was less healthy than a non-vegan diet, but it only took 5 years off your life, the consequences of going vegan are still going to outweigh it. There's no there's no viable alternative, you know, in that case. But overall, the consequences generated suggest that we should be vegan nevertheless. So all the things that she mentioned there, those could all go away. It's just if the results of them going away only generated like so much loss in well-being or so much suffering, it would still be the case that we would be obligated towards ending the animal holocaust. So yeah, it's just not clear where the line is being drawn there. And if there is a line being drawn there, it needs to be made explicit so that the comparison between capitalism and socialism can be made.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, you two probably know a lot more about this particular topic, but even accepting her claim that you need to clearly know the consequences before saying that a current system is wrong, it's not clear to me that at the time that the vegan movement was just getting started, all of the science was clearly sorted out on this issue, right? I mean, now we know with the literature that you can not only safely become a vegan, but veganism is, you know, superior across a number of different health metrics than other diets. But at the time that it was getting started, it's not clear that this was, you know, very straightforward. But that's certainly not an argument against, you know, the movement at that point.
Yeah, I did briefly point this out in my write-up that it does cause a prima facie grounding problem, actually. There have been many cases where no viable alternative is on the table. Nevertheless, there is a consequentialist argument for moving to the other because the practical alternative is discovered in the process of switching to it. You know, that's part of the process. When Watson and others were switching to veganism, there weren't good studies on vegan longevity. There weren't good studies on vegan health. The vegans out there were incredibly few and far between. It was only like a small subset of Jains who, and other ahimsic individuals who even then did not necessarily restrict their diet to a vegan diet all the time. A lot of that science has happened in the meantime. So it's unclear whether she thinks that, you know, we should have done all the tests before there was an obligation, or if like people like Donald Watson and others were just acting irrationally. It's just a very weird claim all around.
Us or until like clean meat were a thing. Morality is a product of choice. When it comes to dietary habits and food production, we have a choice and we need to start making the right choice. When it comes to economics, the claim that we have a viable choice in communism just is not true. None of this means that we shouldn't research economic theory and try to find something better. Just like in the hypothetical can't be vegan world, hopefully we would research how to make B12, how to farm without manure. What it does mean is that it's wrong to advocate for abolishing capitalism based on some hypothetical work and basically a leap of faith. I'm not the vegan police. I don't like to tell.
Yeah, so again, she just sort of like has this like very dismissive tone about a lot of this, and she even says right in that video explicitly that she thinks that at the point where we didn't have a clear evidence pool for the effects of veganism on health and the generation of things like B3, that there was no ethical obligation or ethical reason to go vegan. But for the reasons that Ask Yourself pointed out, and for the reasons that you've pointed out, it's just unclear why that would be the case. There are consequences to our actions, and that's how we evaluate those actions. It's a very unclear view, and then it's followed up with this sort of like vague appeal, which you and I have talked at length about. It's not clear that there's no viable alternative. The only reason that it appears that there's no viable alternative is because she's being highly selective about the evidence, and restricting the ability for us to talk about doing experiments as we go, which are sort of naturally how politics has to be done. It's a very dismissive way to approach the point. When I started off in the video, I said that I wanted to.
I'm worried. Sorry. I'm worried. There's a slight difference in what we said there. I'm not sure I can directly repeat back what you said, but I just want to make sure that.
There is a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, because the point that I made was just that it doesn't make sense if you're a utilitarian or consequentialist. If it doesn't, I just take those words to be interchangeable. It doesn't make sense to hold a view like that and say that a necessary condition for moral wrongness is I forget if it was awareness of an alternative or the existence of an alternative, but either are not a necessary condition for moral wrongness on utilitarianism, right? Because it's just all it means for something to be morally wrong. Okay, well, I shouldn't say this, because someone might not say that all it means for it to be morally wrong is that there's negative utility. They might say there's a difference in the meaning of wrong and negative utility. But the point is just like, negative utility is going to tell you when a situation is right or wrong.
Right. Yeah. The way that I saw it is there was sort of.
I didn't mean to add that wrinkle there, right? But because there's different kinds of there's people who are gonna be kind of utilitarian, but it's almost like just a language thing. Like when they say X is wrong, literally the only thing they mean is X has negative utility. But there's people who might still think that you can make like moral statements, and that's they're not just. They think they would say that they're saying something more than just that it has negative utility, but negative utility is like coincident with that moral wrongness, even if they're separate things, right? So, but the point is, it doesn't matter what kind of view you take there. I was just worried I made a statement that made it sound like I was committed to one, but yeah, the point again is just you don't need for there to be an alternative or for you to be aware of an alternative for something to be wrong on consequentialism.
Yeah, I think.
So if that's what you were saying, we agree. Sorry to cut off so much there. Is that what you were saying, or are you kind of?
No. I extended upon it. I think that there's even more of an issue where, for example, just the fact that there's no viable alternative, it doesn't get us to the point that there's no question about the morality whatsoever. Because like you said, there is this level of utility that we can judge it by. I think that the only system where it becomes meaningless is on a scalar utilitarianism, where it's definitionally that morality is chosen with respect to all the other viable options. So scalar utilitarianism, as I understand it at least, does invoke this idea that there should be multiple options on the table, at least epistemically. So you should have the idea that you could have done something else, and then you compare those things, and then the idea is that something isn't right or wrong. It's right or wrong relative to another option. That's like the only kind of utilitarianism, I think, where her view would be correct. But even on scalar utilitarianism, my view was that it just doesn't apply to this situation, because it's not clear that there is no other alternative. The trivial alternative in any case is to just stop practicing. And so my contention was with the idea that what it means for something to be an option within the context of consequentialism is that it's practicable. The negative utilitarians, people like Benatar, are famous for advocating for us to stop practicing. They think that we just should not practice life anymore because life is necessarily, or at least very probably, going to be highly negative overall. So it's not clear that there is no viable alternative. There are certainly viable alternatives, in at least the case of veganism versus non-veganism.
To tell people they're not vegan or fake vegan or anything like that. That said, I do think that anti-capitalist sentiment is inherently anti-vegan, at least currently. If we also mean the human animal when we talk about animals in the definition of,
so I do like that she eventually in the video does actually like tamper her statement down. She says that it's inherently anti-vegan, at least currently. It's sort of sucks that it took us over half of the video to get to that point, because now it's more clear that what she's instead doing is sort of a comparative analysis. She's saying something like, I think if we were to steelman her, that the instrument of capitalism is a more useful instrument to the goals of veganism, and that's something that's fine. I think that if you were to steelman the entire view, what you would want to do is make that argument that the tools of capitalism and the marketplace and the technologizing and autonomizing factors of capitalism are relevant tools to veganism. The issue is that there are many kinds of anti-capitalism that won't disagree with you there. Again, as we mentioned earlier in the video, Marx himself accepts that there's a necessary stage of capitalism and that you need to have a state of autonomizing or technologizing. There is theoretically anti-capitalist states who would open up a marketplace for vegan ideas to generate vegan technologies or to push veganism. Those are things that are not inconsistent with anti-capitalism, and it just all relates back to the fact that she's using particularly bad definitions of a lot of these words and only really addressing subsets and vague approximations of what she's talking about.
Yeah, I should also point out here that she says being anti-capitalist is currently being anti-vegan. Well, if we're looking at animal agriculture and how it has developed under capitalism, I mean, first of all, we need to point out that animal agriculture predates capitalism, and there's nothing inherent in socialism or communism that would suggest it'll be abolished after capitalism. But if you just look at some of the worst excesses or atrocities committed under factory farming and modern slaughterhouses and assembly lines, all of these can be linked to certain capitalist principles. So, for example, the application of Taylorism as a method of organizing production, and the Babbage principle, which was about separating different tasks and different duties among multiple different workers on an assembly line in order to, one, reduce costs, wages, and to also enhance productivity. All of these things have made the animal agriculture far more insidious under capitalist forms of production than possibly under the pre-capitalist forms of production. And what's interesting is that McDonald's was the first modern corporation to incorporate these principles of Taylorism and mass and the Babbage principle to the assembly line. And now that stretches across the entire supply chain, so that you look at how factory farms are organized, how you have overcrowding, all this constant drive to reduce costs in order to enhance profits. All of that is linked to certain capitalist principles. So it's unclear how you can actually say to be capitalist then is to be pro-vegan.
Right. Yeah, it's weird. And I think like one of the important things that you said there, just to highlight it in the attempt to like steelman, I think what is the best the best view coming out of all of this is that there's nothing inherent about socialism either that would suggest that it's going to end the animal holocaust. The the question really is like one of instrumental capacity and tendencies within these systems and what we can do to change those tendencies. But there's really nothing on either side that makes veganism an inherent quality of one or the other. It really is, like a temporal thing and, an element of circumstance. There have been periods in time where capitalism has committed atrocities against humans, the slave trade, various forms of, economic externalities where you have like raw toxic waste dumped into the environment, the development of CFCs, um, even getting into like more radical arguments from the anti-capitalist about, say, for example, like the generation of imperialistic affairs and weapons of mass destruction under capitalism. All of those things are negative consequences of circumstances of capitalism at certain times. But it's not clear that those are inherent qualities of capitalism under all theories of anti-capitalism, nor is it clear that they're inherently not qualities of socialism under all theories of anti-capitalism either. So to me, it's just like it's very confused. And for a video that is now expressly about instruments and about comparisons and one that is supposed to be about evidence-based analysis, there's very little up until this point in the video comparing some of the reasons why animal agriculture has been so bad under capitalism and why, in her view, it would not be as bad under socialism. There's no kind of attempt for a video that's being produced by a consequentialist to compare the utility generated under each from like an evidence-based perspective. And it just totally ignores some of the things that you're talking about, like over accumulation and, some of the methods of production that have been generated. So it's just, it's just another part in this video where it's using unclear definitions and just, a variety of throwaway statements to make a point, which is just not fair. A much better treatment would start with clear definitions from the outset and appeal to the literature on each. And there is a wide variety of literature on each side that make the case for each side. So it's not like that's something that couldn't have been done.
Yeah, exactly.
Of veganism, and clearly anti-capitalists do, otherwise human economics would be irrelevant, then cruelty to humans is not vegan. Trying to push an entire society into, at best, an unknown situation, putting countless livelihoods and lives at risk within that society based on personal ideological reasons, that's cruel. The desire to tear down, for no credible reason, any and all capitalistic systems without regard for the human suffering that has always inevitably resulted is cruel. I know the intent is not cruelty, and I'm not saying intent doesn't matter. It does when we're talking about, someone's personal character. But look, when we're talking about animal agriculture, the intent isn't cruelty there either. The intent is to produce a product and to make money. It's the outcome which is harmful and the indifference to the outcome which is cruel. I don't think intent is any excuse in the face of overwhelming evidence of harm, and ideological blindness to that harm is no excuse. And going back to the second part of the definition of veganism, by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. So no part of veganism as a moral choice makes any sense outside of a standard economic model of supply and demand. Without capitalism, eating plant-based is just symbolic. Promoting personal consumer actions and boycotts and alternatives as morally meaningful makes no sense.
So with this like particular point, there's quite a few anti-capitalists who will make the argument that there's no such thing as supply and demand, or that there's no such thing as market drivers, and there's no such thing as consumer advocacy. And while I think that there are arguments which you might want to bring up in favor of diminishing like the absolute nature of those effects. It's confusing to think that, for one, that those people should be taken, totally seriously without any kind of evidence on their own side. So it's, again, I wonder if this is maybe addressing like an extreme subset of anti-capitalists and in fact strawmanning them. And then the other issue is, again, with with respect to the definitions that are being used, this just cuts against the kinds of anti-capitalism that are still okay with markets, are still okay with using the price signal for determining production, and it cuts against kinds of socialism that might be more libertarian or democratic, where something like a consumer habit might actually play a role in determining production. In fact, as I sort of pointed out with the previous example from China, there are at least some authoritarian regimes that have begun to notice and take into account some of the individual actions and individual pushes in their restricted forms of democracy towards changing the kinds of production. So while I think that the best form of the argument would point at something like this and point at using the price signal and the development of technologies under capitalism as a current instrument for veganism, it's not clear that this cuts against anti-capitalism, or that like it's reasonable to just assume that the only kind of anti-capitalist is the one who is completely nihilistic about supply and demand. It just seems like neither is true.
Right, and I'll just simply say this. I know a lot of, leftists or anti-capitalists will make this argument that supply and demand don't matter. I think we can all agree that's clearly false. That's not the issue, and it would be useful to actually revisit what Marx himself said about this issue. He never claimed that supply and demand don't matter. He said they're very useful for understanding how, prices overshoot or undershoot their actual values. And what he said is that when supply and demand lead to the equilibrium of these prices in the market, then they actually cease to actually explain anything, because you need a mechanism to explain how we understand a current state of affairs to actually be the equilibrium. And that's when he then formulates, his labor theory of value to say that prices themselves are based on quantities of labor, and then how they fluctuate is based on, supply and demand. And of course, how long a product then survives on the market. This is again his theory of use value, will also be, partially based on supply and demand. But it's not, so we can do away with that, straw man as a critique against anti-capitalists. And I just want to also make it clear that, it's not the case that all Marxists or socialists or anti-capitalists would take this position that supply and demand don't matter.
I feel like I keep having little things to say here. I think Bryn might have kind of said this already, but it sounded like she said that there wouldn't be any reason to be vegan if we weren't in a capitalist society, or maybe if we were in communism or something. Like I think the claim was without capitalism there's no point in being, but that seems, or she said it would be purely symbolic, right? Didn't she say that?
It's purely symbolic if there's no such thing as supply and demand, is like the
right, but that assumes that there's no like causal mechanism to sorry, this is kind of silly, but that like it doesn't that assume that there's like no causal mechanism besides supply and demand by which veganism could result in like less animals dying? Like, just to give some plausible like candidates here, like, maybe the government is responsive to like what the people are willing to eat, right? Like maybe if a massive amount of people would be like, if you'd have like protests in the street or people like starving themselves or something, if you wouldn't provide this food, right? Like I don't know, it's just not clear. I should sum up what I'm saying. It's just like it's not clear why you would think that there's no purpose to being vegan if you're not in a capitalist society. And I should also just state for the record, I have no position on capitalism, communism, whatever. But yeah, it seems like there could still be like very like clearly imaginable causal pathways by which veganism could lead to, outcomes like consequentially, right? If you're consequentialist, produce outcomes that are, desirable to someone who's vegan.
Yeah, absolutely. So just one example of a potential society like that, which wasn't capitalist, if you had more democratic, workers themselves had more democratic control over management decisions, and that wasn't just made by certain people in boardrooms. You could fathom that in a socialist society, if large numbers of people who were involved in the production process and making production decisions decided that animal agriculture or commodifying animals was off limits in that type of society, that on principle they were opposed to that type of exploitation or other forms of exploitation or environmentally damaging forms of production, then they could simply vote to outlaw that type of those type of production decisions and that type of commodification. And so at that point you wouldn't even need consumers exercising their vote with their wallet. At that point, you would have already, decided that certain things are off limits for production and for exploitation and for commodification. So that's one way, you could have a causal mechanism in a non-capitalist society. But there are other, hypothesized ways as well, I'm sure.
The presumption of a capitalistic context, a capitalistic society, is part of the definition of veganism. A denial of capitalism or opting out of capitalism in principle, not only does this make vegan ethics irrelevant, it fails to do good in the most cogent way that veganism acts on the world, by changing production. It's a failure to be vegan in any sense, from ethical principle to consequence. So again, I'm not going to call vegans who happen to be anti-capitalist not vegans, but the ideology of anti-capitalism seems inherently at odds with veganism, at least for now. I don't have any political ideology. I'm not, fervently pro-capitalism. I'm not committed to that. I'm not even committed to neoliberal. It's just kind of the closest descriptor to what I currently believe in terms of politics. I think the only kind of label I fervently defend for myself would be consequentialist, but I am definitely anti-capitalism and communism. There is no evidence for it being anything other than a horrible, dangerous political theory when put into practice. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, so that's the end of the video, and for a video that's supposed to be evidence-based, the the extent of the evidence that is received in the video were the screenshots of various famines and quelled uprisings that she screenshots at the one section in the video. There's none of the nuanced differential analysis that's that we were sort of getting at here. There's no nuance about the various kinds of anti-capitalism. So I think that if you wanted to make the argument that's being made here, which I think that the best form of this argument really just is that there are aspects of the marketplace or aspects of capitalism that, at least right now, when there is no clear viable will for communism or socialism, that's a reason to not be as strongly anti-capitalist right now. But even then, that's going to be an argument that requires a sincere amount more evidence than what's on the table here. There's just nothing presented. Now, if you wanted to actually present that evidence, of course, there's a variety of sources on each side that are out there. You could go look at those. I can link them in the Discord. I don't have them there now, but if people want to join there, I can link some stuff. There's a variety of analyses that have looked at consumer action in other contexts as well as in the vegan context that point in this direction. And then there's, of course, analyses about some of the autocratic attempts at veganizing, and you could look at those. So there's a very nuanced discussion here that's just sort of painted over. And the much better one would be much more restricted. It wouldn't make this claim about inherency. It would instead point at the things that I think that, unfortunately, many anti-capitalists who are well-read and well thought on the topic are actually just going to be willing to concede, which is that the price signal is able to generate demand and technologies that might not have otherwise been discovered, or might not otherwise have been discovered quite as fast. And that under a market system, that consumer demand does cause changes in production, but like we've sort of mentioned, that doesn't mean that it's the only way to get to changes in production. There are many other options. So all those things should be accounted for in the argument.
Yeah, I'll just point out that it's clear that her understanding of why communism has failed is because of the corpses that have just piled up as a result of policy failures, deliberate atrocities, and just inadvertent events caused by just a lack mismanagement, so famine, starvation, etc. And of course, we've talked about how you can do the same thing with capitalist societies. I mean, if you just look at, for example, the famines that were engineered in India in the early 20th century by the British, which was a fully capitalist society at that point, in order to export goods, to satisfy luxury capitalist markets, across the world, that reaches something like 50 million. It breaches the 50 million mark just in that period alone. So, I mean, we can always find, a lot of examples of capitalist failures using that definition as well. And even in the United States, there's been studies talking like, that look at the number of deaths in a given year caused by a lack of education, caused by poverty, caused by income inequality, caused by segregation, etc. And those reach in the hundreds of thousands as well. And there's one study, which was done by researchers at Columbia Medical School, which was published in the American Journal of Public Health, and they found in the year 2000, just if you tally up all of those different social factors, the number of deaths in that year alone was something like 870,000, right? And if we did that across a number of different years, I mean, you get the point in terms of how we could clearly point to these excesses under capitalist democracies as well.
Right. It's weird too. I think that like a lot of the like throwaway that ends up being here, it ends up making this like very ideated notion too that I worry limits the efficacy of vegan activity in the world today. I think that you and I would both accept that there's not a terrible amount of evidence that we're near anything like a global, anti-capitalist revolution anytime in the near future. There's even less evidence that if that revolution were to occur today, that it would actually move us closer to a vegan society. There might even be arguments that it would be regressive on that front.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's unclear that we're anywhere close, and so the issue is like we should be accepting about if our goal is veganism within the context of capitalism, we should be looking at all the various mechanisms by which we can create change. And one of the issues I think I end up having with the video is it's sort of like exaggerates, I think, the unary possible nature of consumption. There are many other ways in which vegans can be effective, and it's sort of all of those things together that cause changes. Much of the animal rights legislation that was passed historically was in response to radical action being taken by activists, standing in front of steamrollers, burning down factories. And I'm not advocating for that kind of activity. I'm instead advocating for like reasonable activism, becoming part of the political process. There are individuals out there like Cory Booker in the most recent, American elections who were expressly open to limiting animal agriculture subsidies. Those are all things that we already have within the context of the kind of neoliberal capitalism that she's expressing that are outside of this, capitalism, socialism distinction. And those are all things that vegans should be aware of. So to me, I think that this like hyper focus on this too is a bit problematic. There's definitely a benefit to vegan consumption. I mean, we've seen the explosion of plant-based meats in the past year, with a lot of people consuming them. There's like products out on the market now that are a mixture of the two for people who want to consume less animal product, but don't want to make the complete swap. Those are things that wouldn't exist if there wasn't a demand for that substitution. Those are all technologies that are generated by that kind of consumer activism. But there's a lot else on the table, and those things I think get missed in her argument.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll also just reiterate that while we've critiqued, her views here in this video, it's certainly not the case that, again, being socialist or moving towards a socialist society, as some left-wing YouTubers claim, will automatically usher in veganism. And one, that's not the case. And what's interesting is, for example, if you look at perspective, someone like Perspective Philosophy, who's a leftist, his critique on Bosch's position was actually, I enjoyed watching it, but there was at one point where he said Bosch needs to understand that socialism and veganism go hand in hand. And in this case, Bosch just very bluntly and correctly, in my view, in this instance, just responded, no, it doesn't. There's nothing about socialism that inherently requires me to be a vegan, and he's right about that. So I mean, you need to integrate these these ideas and these different liberation movements into any kind of future society, instead of just assuming that when you have a revolution, these things will work themselves out, which isn't the case.
Right. And then I think the last sort of thing that I want to, as part of this whole subject about how it's just even sort of confusing how this is a question about which one is, or which of these is inherent in the other, because I think you and I both agree that veganism doesn't have either political system inherent in it, and it's sort of very confusing that capitalism would imply veganism or that socialism would imply veganism. A lot of the comments that have been addressing Unnatural Vegan, they make a lot of these errors too, and some of the more confusing errors seem to be completely nihilistic about various aspects. I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to say in particular about that, Isaac. You had some that you had mentioned earlier.
Well, I just kind of wanted to be clear that we're not throwing our hats in with the,
Right.
frothing mobs of idiots who are criticizing her right now. I haven't, I mean, maybe this is overstating. I was going to say I have no doubt that most of her downvote ratio is just from brain dead, Bosch fans, but that's obviously, a huge exaggeration, but because I don't know where the fuck these people are coming from or whose fans they are, but yeah, I guess I just wanted to, I don't think there's much more to it than that. I just wanted to say, look, there's some kind of nuanced critique that can be made. You guys were kind of going off in chat about it, and, you guys have interesting things to say, and I'm happy to, platform a critique like that. But I just want to be clear that, I think I think all three of us would say that, a sizable amount of the criticism that she's getting in the comment section is just garbage.
Yeah, I haven't looked through the comments in depth as you guys might have, but yeah, just from what I saw, a lot of them are just basic mistakes. The supply and demand example I raised earlier is just one of them, where the people who are leftists clearly. I think you posted that right in the archives. I was looking at one of those comments. Just really don't understand the Marxist critique of supply and demand at all. And when they make arguments that supply and demand doesn't matter at all because agriculture has subsidies, right? That's a complete misunderstanding of how even subsidies function in that context. So yeah, there's a lot of mistakes being made there.
Or there's people trying to not engage with this, the kind of
right.
legacy of communism, which, if your response is to say, well, you're targeting some kind of, proper subset of the set of communist systems or anti-capitalist systems or whatever, and someone need not be committed to any view in the proper subset that you're attacking, that's fine. But there's people who just they just they're blowing it off. They don't give a shit. It's like these people are such ideologues. It doesn't matter to them that there's countless people died as a result of I guess I shouldn't say this ideology, but ideologies in this kind of bucket, right? Or the implementation or attempt to implement those ideologies, however we want to phrase it. Ideas in this area have definitely caused some bad shit, or are there's an analysis to do. Okay, I don't want to overstate it. I don't want to understate it, but it's the people who just there's no real rationale given. There's just some meme is thrown out oh, USSR though or something. It's well, it's kind of important to you have to give some kind of proper response to that, either explaining why it doesn't pertain to your view or whatever, but just blowing it off because it's inconvenient. There's something kind of disgusting to me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually a lot like, the American Stalinists in the 1930s. They would dismiss any critique about human rights abuses in the Soviet Union as just a preoccupation with bourgeois rights, which were irrelevant to just the larger revolution, or they would just not engage with it at all. So, yeah, that kind of apologetics is obviously a problem, and we definitely need to confront that and respond to that when it's being done, right? Even if it's in the context of critiquing her video. So it's a good idea to do that.
Yeah, and the other thing is just like, so yeah, just the bigger point there is just we can all identify that there's like any one of us can look at that comment section, find a bunch of stupid. We're not throwing our hats in with the stupid, and I actually think Unnatural Vegan is generally speaking reasonable. There's like like she tries to like follow the science when she talks about like empirical things, and she's never taking views in philosophy that are like some like radical like out of mainstream shit. Like she's taking like safe positions for the most part. So I'm not gonna like I don't think that makes her a pretty like relatable, good like vegan voice to have around. Like I'm not like an anti-UV kind of. I don't think any of us are, but yeah, like if she makes some video where she says some fucking weird shit like she tends to do, and she says like when she talks about morality and says shit like deontology is contradictory, or like I mean, who knows some of the stuff she said in this video. Like, there's times when you just gotta be like, okay, well, I don't know about some of those claims. So yeah, that's all. Just 2 points. The one is just we're not throwing our hat in with the stupid hats, and the other is I think UV's overall good. I'm not like anti UV.
Yeah, no, that's like a thing that I definitely want to underline. I mean, I have in other archives that I have, like I cite some of her videos as good introductions to various topics. And I mean, she's a relatively popular YouTuber for a reason. She generally makes well-informed videos. And it's not that this video was like a complete abomination. I think that the issue is this debate is a lot more nuanced and complex than the 14-minute video that was given to it. And I think that a better treatment of it would have discuss those things from the outset, or would answer the critiques that like Ants and I have given here. And I think that also importantly, and this was maybe one thing that like really surprised me, was that a lot of the reasoning, while not necessarily like nefarious by any means, and definitely not like sophistic, was just sort of unclear. I think that if you wanted to make like a very reasonable argument, a good starting place would to be make like a formal argument using clear definitions that are cited and well respected. There's entire pages on the SCP about anti-capitalism and about capitalism itself, which you could draw definitions from, for example. And you would use that to construct your argument, and then you would appeal to the evidence, and you would make it clear whether or not you're making the necessitation argument, that I pointed out at the beginning, or if you're making something more like an instrumental argument, which it sort of weakened.
Well, and it's not even clear when someone says inherently, which makes you think necessity, and like I don't know, for anyone who wasn't getting all that Bryn was saying about necessity, there it's just like I guess you're taking some kind of it's kind of like standard philosophical construal of necessity is just like it's a property that a proposition can have if it's true in every possible world.
Yeah, I just mean if something is inherent in another, that the denial of that thing in that thing would derive a contradiction. Like saying, if you say anti-capitalism is inherently anti-vegan, it would generate a contradiction to be like an anti-capitalist vegan.
Right. Okay. So you're not talking about some proposition that is itself true in all possible worlds, but a set of two propositions which are never both true in the same possible world.
Yeah, that's how I take inherency to mean.
Yeah, so inherently, like, yeah, so it's kind of unclear what something like inherently right now means. Like that phrasing was very weird to me. So
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Because you can give like a like these very clear kind of like, I guess you use like kind of like modal logic, kind of thinking to make very clear statements about like necessity. Like, what exactly do you mean? Like, you're talking about in every possible world where it's true that some agent believes this, if they hold this belief also, like, they have a contradiction, or like all possible worlds where these two things are both true, or no, there's no possible world where both these propositions are true. Like, there's ways to like cash out talk about necessity like very carefully and exactly. And yeah, the when I hear inherently right now, it's just not doing that. It's like, what are you even talking about? What's
Right.
inherently right now mean?
Yeah, and that's like the big issue I really have with the video is it's just very unclear in a lot of ways. You know, it would be
There's
useful to have
even
a
there's
definition of
even
inherently.
like there's even one point where like she literally pauses. It's kind of like even funny delivery. It's like inherently right now. Like
Right, right, and yeah, and it makes you wonder like what that means.
and
Yeah,
maybe she has some kind of clear construal, and it there, you know, she's not just saying something that kind of superficially seems like it makes sense and she hasn't like thought about it. Maybe it actually is clear to her, but you know, if it is, it didn't really like come across in the video. It left me just thinking, I don't know what the fuck she means if like by inherently right now.
no, of course, and I think that's like the thing. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that she's like malicious or idiotic by any measure. I don't think that this is like a sophistic video. I think that the issue is just a concept that seems very clear to her. It's not clear to the audience, which is, you know, I think part of why there's like this huge, this huge like field of criticism too. Like the criticism ranges because it's not clear that anyone is like really sure what it is that she's saying either, which is why something like a clear formal argument that's like backed up by evidence would have been really useful. It would have been like a much more to the point video if you just had, you know, given clear definitions, cited the relevant literature, and given like an argument with a clear inference structure. All of that clarity, you know, would have made this response much shorter. It would have been, you know, like a comment or two from one of us. It wouldn't have been, you know, the long discussion we had to have.
Well, and it's not too late for that. If she makes more content on the topic, um, that would be advisable, right? Like just
Right, exactly.
define your terms perfectly clearly, so it's not like ambiguous what you're saying in your argument, and just give a formal argument. Because then, and you know, if some of the premises are like kind of obviously open to question, you know, give supporting arguments whose conclusion are the premises that are, you know, questionable about your argument, until you kind of bottom out in propositions that are just like, you know, it's kind of like how could you deny that when you hit a level where there's just going to be like large agreement. Like that's kind of how I think about it. Like you have this proposition you're aiming at, you build an argument for it, support any premises that seem like, it's almost as if every proposition in your argument, whether it's a premise or a conclusion, there's like some level of kind of like, you know, like agreement about it or something like that, socially. I don't know, but you're like what you're trying to do is kind of like build out, you know, like a tree of arguments that are all linked, you know, in a deductive way, right? Where it's like you have an argument, some other argument concludes, and the premises of that argument, and you kind of build that out until you know, hit arguments whose premises are just like, you know, so widely shared that there's not really much room for pushback. Or if it's not about how widely shared it is, it's like the kind of pushback is maybe like uninteresting to you for some reason or another. Like, oh, the kind of guy who takes that position, like, you know, numbers don't exist or something like that. Like, I don't even know how to engage with that guy.
Right.
Right. That's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be deductive either. Like this kind of, you know, premise, you could definitely have an inductive argument for, you know, if you just define inherently as, you know, this very instrumental concept. But the issue there is like it would require appealing to the evidence and actually, you know, bringing up peer-reviewed literature that shows that it's that way. And you don't even necessarily, I think, have to point to vegan evidence. You could, you know, point to the literature on things like, you know, consumer activism
Well,
and whatnot.
I should say, like, I do have a kind of preference for probabilistic deduction over induction, even though there's like not a whole lot of a difference, and all you're doing
Right.
is like one of the premises in your probabilistic deduction is just like basically like induction works. But the thing is, like, there's this kind of weasel door that opens with induction, where since it's not deductively valid, there's room to do weird shit, and I don't like that. I'd rather have something that still has a tight deductive structure, but just one of the
Sure.
premises clearly like makes the inductive assumption. I don't think that that's like, I've never heard anyone advocate that view though. Like I've held that view for a while, so I don't, that's not like popular or anything, but that's kind of, I have that preference for sure for probabilistic deduction over induction.
No, I think I agree with you. I think I'm just using like the terms coextensively just because I think more people are familiar with induction. I agree with you that
Well, they're
like,
not they're not the same though, obviously.
Right.
Well, I'm sure I don't need to say that, but
yeah, I'm just using them that way. I think because I think you're right. Like one of the big things is that what would be useful is a clear, valid, deductive inference structure. That's like one thing that would really be aided in a further video, or if someone else wanted to generate a steel man of this argument.
Yeah, I think we talked about steel manning her argument, and I mean, I don't know what you guys think, but it seems to me the core claim, argument, or proposition she's trying to put forward here is that since supply and demand are crucial components of capitalism, provides the best mechanism through which, or best system through which, individual citizens and consumers can exercise autonomy when it comes to, abolishing or promoting different industries, which, in the end, would be the way to actually usher in a purely vegan society. I mean, I think there's problems with that type of a view, but it seems to me that that's what she's trying to say here.
it seems to me like there's probably a few different lines of reasoning. I mean, I think that's one of them. But there's also the stuff about like, historical communism bad. There's other kind of lines of reasoning in there too, surely.
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
So maybe it's like a cumulative case or something. Maybe it's like
Right. Yeah.
historical communism bad. Which, not to trivialize, like historical communism, it's pretty fucking bad. But and maybe like consumer influence better under capitalism, and it's maybe something like moral risk of it moving into something untested, right? Because we don't know the outcomes with communism. Right. So it's kind of like a bunch of those things like together.
Right. Yeah. Well, like those are all things I think we've mentioned, and like those are things that would go into like a cumulative consequentialist case, I think. And like a lot of the things that we've ourselves sort of like dismissed, like there are definitely arguments against us. I don't think that either of us is claiming that this is like a resolved issue. I think that these questions are all open-ended questions, and so a lot of these comments, and claims, like things like we don't know, what a socialist, anti-capitalist, post-capitalist society would look like, or what would generate. That's a relevant criticism, and that's something that should be included in like a formal deduction about the topic for sure.
Yeah, I absolutely definitely. And we should also point out it wasn't clear at all that capitalism would even emerge, let alone what it would look like, under feudalism or during that period. So it's important to keep that in mind.
I think people also are going to be curious about the positions that like we take, probably mostly positions you guys take. 'Cause I don't really take much of an interest in you, and people kind of know my position on this stuff. Like, I just haven't read much about politics. I have other interests. Maybe I will at some point. So, I don't really take like a strong or any position like capitalism, socialism, whatever. I'm kind of like, I have somewhat of a normative ethic. Like I have maybe something that's close to like a threshold deontic view. That seems to like, I'm not like committed to threshold deontology, but that seems to capture the kind of preferences I have fairly well. And I'm just looking at what kind of policies seem to produce outcomes that align with my normative ethic, right? So it's like if some policy has an outcome of like preserving rights, right? That's going to be good. Or like if it has an outcome of maximizing well-being, that's going to be good. And so I'm kind of for trialing, sensible policies in either direction, right or left, and retaining the ones that seem to produce good outcomes. And I'm kind of an incrementalist about it too, where it's like, I don't want to make big leaps. Like, I think like the burden to like show how good the leap is going to be gets like bigger and bigger, like the more radical the changes that you're talking about. Because bigger changes there's more like unknown coming in, like more you don't know what to happen. Maybe you could say more like moral risk or something. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have an economic ideology. I'm just kind of, I have like a normative ethic. I try to align my views with that. and I haven't really looked into it much, but people are going to wonder where you guys sit, because you actually think about this shit and have, like, positions. And probably a lot of people think that, I'm assuming most people will watch this and think you're, like, communists or something, so, yeah. I don't actually know exactly where Ants falls, but I know Bryn actually isn't a communist. Yeah, sorry, but where you guys should kind of articulate your own positions.
Yeah, I'd say probably I believe Marxism is a great analytical tool for understanding how societies function and different systems of economic organization. But in terms of what I would advocate for, I guess you could probably classify me as a Democrat or a socialist libertarian. So I believe that there should be a, a, a role for government, obviously, in regulating the business cycle and eradicating poverty and ensuring there's employment opportunities available, and just involved in the process of industrialization and upgrading of any given society. But at the same time, there should be a range of negative freedoms that are protected, in which the government can't intrude without properly justifying itself into the lives of individuals and households. So I'm all for like a mixed market socialist type of economy organized along those lines. So, I mean, there's really no clear. I mean, looking at past historical examples of what we see as to be communist societies, obviously massive flaws with them, and that's not what I'm advocating for at all currently.
Yeah, and then historically, I've been pretty partial to communism, but at least for the past like half a year or so, I would probably have described myself closer to the term that I actually suggested that she labeled herself as, which is ordo-liberal. One of the commentaries that's been given on ordo-liberalism before by Foucault, in fact, was that ordo-liberalism is sort of the progression past Marxism in like the contemporary, scientific world, that it sort of does away with these like global or universal narratives that are embedded into things like Marxism, and instead it looks at the irrationality of systems that are unrestricted. And so I'm pretty disposed to like evidence-based policy that looks at maximizing things that I consider to be good outcomes. So I have my own theories of like well-being and what tracks and correlates with that, and then uh, ordo-liberalism is focused on utilizing the right tools that are evidence-based. And so I would label myself as someone who's technically pro-capitalist, although I have a lot of criticisms about unrestricted capitalism. I'm very open to the idea that there are many failures within capitalism and a lot of irrationality that needs restriction and policy, and that sort of like you said earlier, though, that policy itself shouldn't be radical, that it should be incremental and well thought out. So,
well, and if it is radical anywhere, there's just a bigger burden. Like, I'm not saying like maybe there are areas like climate where it's like there's actually like we do need to do something radical, and the case is there for it, right?
Right, of course.
But yeah, it's just about the burden. It's not actually in opposition to anything radical. It's just gotta meet the burden for
it. Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think. Well, even then, I think like there's other things that I think get baked into at least my notion of like radical. Like the tempo of things, or how differential it is, and stuff like that. Those are all things that I think that we should be wary of. But yeah, that's my general idea. Unfortunately, sort of is how she described herself. It's just I don't think that neoliberalism is the right term for that, which is one of the reasons why I was like sort of opposed to that term from the outset, because I think UV and I agree on what a political system should look like. I just think that there's actually already a defined term and a defined group of individuals who work on that. They just call themselves ordo-liberals, or like I guess they would just call themselves like evidence-based policy wonks. At least within the literature, there's been like this movement away from like capitalism versus socialism. People tend to more talk about like their specific microcosm of economics that's relevant instead.
Yeah, I'll just point out that one of the main failures I think of capitalism right now, and what needs to be a priority, is income redistribution. And So, I mean, Thomas Piketty has written quite a bit about this and, Capital in the 21st Century, and he put forward a very simple thesis. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but he essentially argued that capitalism generates inequality over time because the rate of return on capital tends to exceed the rate of economic growth. And so as a result of that, if you wanted to actually put an end or, somehow mitigate income inequality, you needed things like, a government role for redistribution through a wealth tax or the Tobin's tax, a tax on financial markets, etc. So I mean that can really be the priority now. He doesn't advocate for this socialism, meaning the collectivization of the means of production or the expropriation of capitalists, and that's fine. But something in terms of this area should definitely be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that like the like big like buzz term for like the economics that I talk about and look at is looking at like the Pareto efficiency of a system, or looking at the distribution of wealth. And so yeah, I'm really interested in like policies that limit the inefficiency, or limit the dispersion of outcomes, and then also policies that like raise the floor. There's reason to think that at a certain point, like relative dispersion wouldn't matter so much, so long as like everyone had a certain sufficient kind of outcome. Now, of course, there's issues when you get into like insane amounts of wealth and insane amounts of dispersion, despite like a relatively like high standard of living. So, for example, even like the poorest people in America are wealthier than some of the richest in, say, for example, like India.
Yeah, for sure.
But even within that system, there are people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos who have a level of wealth that confers like a level of power that is problematic. But I agree that like that's like the focus of my politics, is figuring out how do we raise the floor of the standard of living, and how do we make that as widespread as possible.
Yeah, I agree with that. That should be the priority for sure.
Any closing words? I mean, I guess you kind of just gave them, but anything else before we go? This has been really good. I think I probably will actually put this on the main channel, because I think people will really like this, even if they're triggered with me for not putting out content for fucking ever because I've been in school. But yeah, it was really good, so people will like it. Is there anything else that you guys want to get in there? Or?
I think I've covered everything I wanted to say. I just want to thank you once again for the platform, and I hope people enjoy the discussion if they listen to it.
Yeah, anytime, man. Absolutely.
I think to just wrap it up again, what we're not trying to do here is like completely bash the point or bash her. I think that there's a lot that should be said here, and I think that if individuals are more interested in the topic and find themselves making a lot of these like very broad statements and don't know that they have like the best understanding of economics, there's a lot of resources out there for learning economics of all sorts, including heterodox economics like Marxist economics, and including orthodox economics, which would allow you to become much more familiar with the arguments. So definitely like reach out and check those out. And instead of like bringing in these like sweeping generalizations, you should check out the like relevant online communities for these labels too. There's a pretty active neoliberal community if you search it up, and there's a pretty active anti-capitalist community out there, and both of those have relevant points that I think that viewers should engage with before coming to any conclusions about how they view it, and before then sort of take a position like you have, which is one of like agnosticism or ambiguity about which or the other is preferable. But yeah, thanks for the platform. It was an enjoyable conversation, and I hope that actually a future video on the topic is made by UV, clarifying her stances and providing some evidence on both sides.
Yeah, and I'm sure, although I don't think UV ever does live discussions, I'm sure either of you are happy to talk with her in private. I assume I'm not speaking for you here, like, well, I am, but I assume you agree. Sorry, is what I mean to say. I assume that you're down to talk to her verbally or in private if she wants to like go over any of the criticisms or anything.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Yeah, I'll put their links down below. All right, guys. Well, that was fucking awesome, and thanks for sharing your points of view. It's good to know people like you and get to just chill out and watch analysis.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, have a good day, guys.
Bye.